Good afternoon, everybody. Just before I start, some of you may have already heard the distressing news that my friend and colleague Nigel Penn, after giving a lecture in summer school yesterday afternoon, went home to Kenilworth and popped in briefly to the cafe to buy something and was attacked by somebody and knocked on the head, managed to get home and then collapsed unconscious. He's now in intensive care. The latest update is that he regained consciousness briefly, spoke a few words, and then relapsed into unconsciousness. So, the summer school is in touch with his partner James, and James is giving updates on... Sorry. I must just get control of myself, then we'll carry on. All right, well, let's hope for the best. And yes, of course, this reminds us that violence is not an abstract concept, something that happens to other people. It's something that can happen to anybody at any time. But let me try and get out of this frame of mind and try and address the topic today, which is revolutionary terror, colonial empire, and massacre in Europe during the revolutionary period. I've already suggested that we are looking at France in this batch of lectures on massacre during the revolutionary period on the frontiers of colonialism, because France was itself a colonial enterprise. It was an empire that was trying to spread revolutionary ideals throughout the world. It was somewhat restricted in its global reach, was France, by the fact that it lost the naval tussle with Britain, and then, as a result, never really succeeded in exporting the French Revolution beyond the mainland of Europe. There are a few exceptions, of course, the island of San Domingo, which is now called Haiti. But the French Revolution, the armies of the French Revolution, the French Empire itself during this revolutionary period was largely confined to mainland Europe. And this map shows you at the time of 1789, when the revolution broke out, the almost immediate, as it were, positive response it had in a variety of other countries. And just to remind you that the French Revolution was about the spreading of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which was widely understood as actually being about doing away with the ancien regime, doing away with aristocracy, doing away with monarchy, doing away with the grip of the established church, in this case Catholicism. And this message, liberty, equality, fraternity, was of course, and the prospect of overthrowing feudalism in the ancient regime was very, very popular in many European countries. And many European countries, as it were, rushed to embrace the ideals of the revolution, which involved many of these countries in processes of struggle, of counter-revolution and oppression. And without giving you too much of a history of the French Revolution, eventually, as you know, the French state itself, having executed the king, the French state itself was forced to fight for a while on the defensive as the massed armies of the ancien regime, the crowned heads of Europe, formed an alliance and tried to attack the new French Republic. And this was the period which really launches what we call the terror in France, as the leaders of this new modernizing, secular, revolutionary state, supposedly based on the ideas of the Enlightenment, anti-monarchical, anti-clerical, is grappling with the problem of how to deal with the will of the people, with people's power. And of course, what the people were, of course, why they embraced the revolution was they thought that they were in charge of it. They wanted to be in charge of it. This is the people's will, the people's revolution. And they expressed this will and their desire for revolution through violence. The French Revolution was an incredibly violent event, and those who were trying to ride the tiger of the revolution, trying to keep state control, were conflicted. They did not want the revolution to be wrested from their hands by the violence of the people. In a way, they had to control the people, they had to legitimize the state. Has to keep control of violence itself as much as possible to stay in charge. The state cannot allow everybody to exercise and wield violence indiscriminately. The state has to keep control of violence. And hence the terror, in a sense, was the state's response to keeping control, fighting violence with violence. Terror was a tactic used by the French state or the people who were desperately trying to keep power in the French state. Terror was a tactic to try and keep power. And in this scenario, even someone like Robespierre, who most of you will associate with the terror, Robespierre himself, the chief terrorist #1, is sometimes portrayed as a counter-revolutionary, as a counter-terrorist. He is trying to curb terror through terror. As you know, Robespierre himself ended up on the guillotine, and so there was a tremendous amount of bloodletting in France during this, I suppose, battle for stability by the new revolutionary state against the forces that it had unleashed. And this map, whoops, there goes my microphone. This map shows you to some extent the turmoil and the fighting and the use of terror within France even before the revolution was exported, which it was largely after 1802. This, what I'm trying to suggest to you here is that massacre and terror were used as a tool by the French state within France long before it was exported to the colonies of France. And indeed, the French state saw many of its own citizens, and this of course is a contested term in the French Revolution. Who exactly is a citizen? Is everybody a citizen? Or are some citizens more, well, in the words of George Orwell, more equal than others? Should women be citizens? Should slaves be citizens? Should foreigners be citizens? And certainly should aristocrats be citizens? Should royalists and loyalists be citizens? To decide these issues are often decided by bloodshed and by violence, by the use of massacre. And so massacre as a tool of policy, as a political expression of will, becomes very prevalent and common in revolutionary France. You probably everybody has done, once again, every schoolboy knows, because you all did the French Revolution once upon a time. Everybody knows that the storming of the Bastille was accompanied by a modest massacre of the inhabitants of the Bastille, even if there were only a few lunatics, and luckily the Marquis de Sade had just escaped in time. But anyway, the garrison was massacred. In 10th of August 1792, the Swiss Guard who was guarding Louis XVI were massacred to a man by the mob. And the mob continued to try and massacre people when there's the great fear that the invading armies of Europe were crossing the borders of France. The mob entered the prisons and massacred all the prisoners because they thought the prisons were hotbeds of treachery and royalism. So, in other words, this is an extremely blood-stained chapter of French history, and massacre is one of the most prevalent tools of political influence. One of the most notorious regions that suffered massacre was this region of France, in the west of France, just below Nantes, just below Brittany, the Vendée. In 2016-2017, I was lucky enough to have a fellowship in Nantes, and somebody told me that it was well worth a visit to the Museum of Vendée to see how the treatment of the massacre in Vendée was treated. And it was indeed, I'll show you some slides in a moment, of this museum dedicated to the memory of the massacre of the inhabitants of Vendée. These are French people. What makes them slightly different or worthy of massacre in the eyes of the French is, I suppose, that many of them were peasants who, many of them were loyal to their lords and masters, which was shocking in a revolutionary context. Many of them were loyal to their priests. They hated the idea that the priests were going to be all defrocked and that basically the church was going to be abolished. They also hated the idea of the attack on Catholicism that was taking place. And once the new French state began to try and implement conscription, they hated that idea as well. So this was a particularly obdurate, reactionary, royalist, loyalist area. And as a result, the French revolutionary state targeted it, sent in what they would call infernal columns. Flying columns of soldiers whose job it was to root out dissent, to find loyalists and to put them to death. Basically, their instructions were not to negotiate, not to parley, not to get surrender, but to exterminate. And this sort of eradicationalist discourse has caused many of the people studying this, particularly if they are of descent from Vendéan people, to suggest that this is an example of genocide. But I would suggest this is not genocide, because these people are not being killed because of their race, they're Frenchmen after all. They're being killed because of really their political belief, and because they are in the way of a modernizing secular revolutionary state. It's estimated that anywhere close between about 175,000 to 250,000 Vendéans were massacred. This is 250,000 people, which amounts to about 4% of the population of the Vendée. And many of them were killed in highly imaginative ways. I'm afraid this picture is a bit small. If it was larger, you would see semi-naked women who are being led towards being drowned in the River Loire at Nantes. Some of them tied to men, I suppose, and with a sadistic sort of slogan surrounding their death that this was a revolutionary marriage. In other words, you humiliate men and women, you tie them together, and then you drown them. Later on, whole barge loads of people were put into barges which had trapdoors in the bottom of the boat and sunk in the River Loire. Why go to these lengths, I don't know. Otherwise, of course, burning, bayoneting, shooting, massacring was good enough. And of course, the memory of these events is etched into the inhabitants of Nantes and the Vendée even today. And a great deal was made, I mean, especially when Napoleon and the revolution was over and the monarchy was restored. A great deal of propaganda made a great deal of these atrocities, and some lurid paintings were made to depict the cruelties of the fate of the people of the Vendée, which nonetheless doesn't alter the fact that thousands, hundreds of thousands of the people of the Vendée were killed. Some of them did try to resist. You might ask, was this a massacre? Weren't they in arms trying to fight for their cause? And the answer is yes, some of them were in arms, but mostly they were peasants. They were poorly armed, poorly led, and basically in confrontations with the military, the men were no competition for the revolutionary armies, and once the men had been killed, women and children were massacred. So this is, I suppose, one of the most famous examples of massacre as a tool of policy. Eventually, the revolt was crushed. The people of the Vendée had looked for support from England, from emigres living in England. It didn't come. Here you see there's a sort of particular little chapel which is part of the memorial to the massacres, which celebrates one particularly horrible massacre where 564 of the inhabitants of a village were put to death. A priest somehow survived, and uniquely for his time and place, he made it his business to record the names of every man, woman, and child who had been killed. He didn't want them to go into the grave unrecognized, unlamented, and he wrote the names, and these names are now recorded on the walls of this chapel. This is the sort of museum which includes part of the memorial to the victims of the massacre in the Vendée. It's a beautiful place. It's park-like. You can walk through lovely trees and rivers, and every now and then there's a stark reminder of what happens. And needless to say, local, I suppose, Vendée nationalism still exists. Just across the border in Brittany, there was similar extermination of resisting Bretons called the Chouans. And this region of France is still pretty much anti-Republican, pro-Catholic, and probably quite right-wing if you were to go into the politics of the area too much. Why am I telling you all of this? Simply because I went there and it made an impression on me, and of course it is terribly, terribly important in the history of massacre. But let's move on now for a while from the internal suppression of resistance in France to the exportation of the revolution to the rest of Europe, which really happens from about 1792 onwards and is associated in its latter stages, of course, with the Emperor Napoleon, who, you have to admit, does bear somewhat resemblance to President Macron, or maybe it's just the way Macron does his hair. I'm not sure. He would like, I think, us to compare him to Napoleon. Anyway, as the revolutionary armies managed to, with the fanaticism of the people behind them, managed to stop, defeat, and then turn the tables on their enemies, the French began to try and set up, as it were, sympathetic satellite states. Some countries had annexed just wholeheartedly, like Belgium becomes annexed to France. Others have puppet regimes installed in them, like the Netherlands. Some are declared to be sort of so-called sister republics, like Switzerland, the Rhineland, the Netherlands, and Italy. But later, of course, kingdoms were reimposed on these areas, which is, by the way, anti-revolutionary. And these kingdoms are very often governed or ruled by monarchs who come from Napoleon's own family, which also, by the way, is not very revolutionary. To appoint your own brother King of Naples, for instance, is a betrayal of the revolution, in case any of you are wondering. I remember at school we always had the essay question, did Napoleon fulfill the ideals of the revolution? Well, let's wait and see whether you think he did. In all, at various stages in French, in the history of the expansion of the French Empire, in all as many as 20 French colonies, we can call them, existed in different parts of Europe at different times. But these colonies were not so much based on the settlement of French people on the land to become settler colonists or farmers. These colonists were based rather on control of the political institutions and extraction of resources, extraction of economic resources, agricultural resources, and of course conscription, extraction of manpower resources. And also this is an example of an empire of conquest and domination. Now, until recently, most historians have been interested in the subject of Napoleon, and believe me, there are tens of thousands of them. The literature on Napoleon is huge, and I'm by no means a Napoleonic scholar. A lot of what I'm telling you, going to be sharing with you, is based on the research of my colleague Philip Dwyer, who is the expert on Napoleon. But until recently, a lot of research on Napoleon and the French Empire and the Napoleonic Wars has, of course, been a military history on battles, on military tactics, the revolution in military techniques, Napoleon, the military genius, etc., etc. And what hasn't really attracted much attention is how did the French maintain control of the empire that they won through this military excellence, through their ability to win battles? How did they then control the territories which they occupied? And here we move from, I suppose, a study of conventional warfare to a study of unconventional warfare, guerrilla warfare, or rule through, to put it crudely, massacre and terror. Because the upholders of the new revolutionary French state believed that they were spreading enlightenment, reason, and a secular government. They believed they were, in other words, spreading civilization. The French believed they were the most civilized people on earth, that their manners were the most civilized, their language was the most civilized, their philosophy, their culture, and other European nations noted this feeling of superiority. And so when the French began to expand into Europe, the French believed that they were agents of civilization and enlightenment. And anybody who opposed this was either an idiot, a reactionary, a royalist, or a Catholic obscurantist. Now, a lot of people think that Napoleon was somehow sympathetic to the Catholic Church because at one stage he got himself, but in fact he got the Pope next to him and then he took the diadem from the Pope's hands and crowned himself emperor. But he needed the approval of the Catholic Church, but he wasn't going to let the Catholic Church make him emperor. So a lot of people think that because he came from a Catholic background, he was Corsican, he was sympathetic to the Catholic Church. He actually wasn't. He hated it, he hated Catholic priests, he hated the superstition of Catholicism, and he saw the Catholic Church as one of his big enemies. And of course most of the countries which he went on to occupy had, the Catholic Church was a strong presence, and he hated it. So he was, the French project then was extremely intolerant of opposition, and let us spend a while now to see how it dealt with opposition. It's no surprise, no secret, that I'm going to be stressing the use of massacre as a way of dealing with the opposition. Massacre was a conscious policy of the French military and the French political leaders. Not only Napoleon, but many of his generals, Castine, Massena, Murat, Soult, the Minister of War, Carnot, all of these people were in favor of massacre. They used massacre as a deliberate policy. They didn't shy away from it. They gave instructions for people to massacre, and initially they didn't try and hide it either. Let me give you an example. One of Napoleon's most famous quotes is one that he used frequently when confronted with civilian resistance. Burn a village. A sort of a three-word famous quote. Whenever confronted with resistance, his solution was burn a village. This was first put into effect, well, perhaps not first, but a famous example, famous in Napoleon's life, and one that he always went back to, was 23rd of May 1797, when the French reacted to local resistance around the town of Benasco in Lombardy. 600 peasants were massacred and the village leveled to the ground. As Michael Brewers, who is one of the foremost historians of Napoleon, explains, this was hardly the first village flattened by the revolutionary juggernaut, nor would it be the last. Napoleon reported on the incident thus: a vast conspiracy was hatched against us. Milan, Pavia, Como, all rose against us at the same moment. While returning to Milan on the side road to Pavia, we were met by 1,000 peasants from Benasco. We beat them. After having killed 1,000 of them, we burned the village. A dread example and a useful one. In an hour, we march on to Pavia, where they are still resisting us. This is from one of his letters. So, in other words, we killed 1,000 of them, a good example. When he took Pavia on the 26th of May, every single armed man was immediately killed, with Napoleon issuing an order to shoot all of those who were taken in arms. The city was then given over to his troops for a 24-hour spree of rape, pillage, looting, and murder. If you want a further example, his correspondence is full of it. Letter from Napoleon to Juno: have 5 or 6 villages burnt, have about 60 people shot, set extremely severe examples. You can see his complete disregard for life here. About 60 people, just it doesn't matter who they are, just shoot them. Now, such massacres were perhaps nothing new in global history or European history. If we go back as recently as the 17th century, for example, in 1683, the Turks outside Vienna seized an Austrian town called Berchtesgaden and massacred all of the inhabitants, even though they had surrendered. A few years later, in 1686, when the city of Buda was liberated from the Turks, they in turn were massacred in their thousands by the forces of the so-called Holy League. In other words, it was part of European warfare, or warfare on the borders of Europe, that if you took a city or a town that had resisted you, you were entitled to rape, massacre, pillage, and destroy that town. If the town had surrendered, though, it was perhaps not so acceptable, but still it was done. And we can find many such examples before the French Revolution or before the revolutionary period. What I'm trying to stress here is that if Europeans can do such things to their own people, you can understand they would have absolutely no scruples about doing the same thing to indigenous people in faraway non-European colonies. And in fact, many of the people in the Revolutionary Wars who had served in the Revolutionary Wars went on to have positions of authority and leadership in the colonies of Europe in the 19th century. So in a way, the Revolutionary Wars are a schooling ground for massacre and this sort of treatment. Let me... all right, so now Napoleon sets up various colonies, we can call them that, of France, whatever their name is. These are sort of areas under colonial occupation, and in these they are he doesn't scruple to use the methods of terror, the methods of massacre that have been perfected in the French Revolution itself. Let me give you some comparative figures. During the period of terror during the French Revolution, modern historians estimate that death by guillotine, firing squad, and other methods amounted to around 40,000 people. So only 40,000 people were killed by guillotine, firing squad, and maybe a few of them drowned in the river Loire, as we've seen. Somebody has calculated that 16,500 people were guillotined in France during the French Revolution. 16,500 guillotined. If we include the casualties from the Vendée that I've just talked about, which I've said could amount to as many as 250,000 deaths. It is thought that the terror in France cost the lives of between about 200,000 and 300,000 French people. The period of terror in the French Revolution, guillotining, the Vendée, etc., 200 to 300,000 people. Okay, let's move now to when this system is exported to the rest of Europe, what happens? In areas outside of France, those parts of Europe affected by French conquest, an estimated 750,000 to 3 million civilians died between 1793 and 1815. So between about 1 and 3 million civilians died. In southern Italy, Calabria, which is basically the boot and heel of Italy, there were a number of revolts against French rule. This was the so-called Kingdom of Naples, which was ruled by one of Napoleon's brothers. In Calabria, the population diminished by 21,000 out of a total of 800,000. Estimated 4% of the population. Now, some of these deaths might be attributed to famine, starvation, but many of them were caused by massacre. The total number of civilian deaths in Spain between 1808 and 1814 is estimated at between 560,000 and 885,000. That is 4 to 5% of the Spanish population. These are, massive figures for to contemplate. So, in other words, the impact of French rule on Europe was not benign, it was not benevolent. It caused, in some cases, death rates of between 2 to 5% of where the system was installed. Why this orgy of killing, you might ask? Was it really necessary? Part of it was out of fear of revolt, and part of it was as revenge for resistance or retaliation. If French soldiers were attacked by civilians, then they moved in and killed them. If there'd been an uprising or a rebellion, then there's retaliation and revenge. So there were many instances of insurrection and revolt throughout Europe under French rule. A French historian called Aurélien Lignerot has inventoried a total of 460 revolts between 1800 and 1813. 460 revolts in Europe against French rule in the territories annexed to the empire. A further 71 revolts took place in the year 1814 alone. And these revolts do not include the 1,000 or so revolts that took place within France itself. I mean, think about this. This is a highly repressive regime, and there's a great deal of fight back against it. 1,000 revolts in France against the French Revolution. Napoleon termed many of these revolts brigandage. He blamed them on brigands, thieves, And indeed, brigandage was a problem, but this is a problem caused by a lack of legitimacy in the social and political order. A lot of people did take to the forests and the mountains and did attack the French state. They would have perhaps thought of themselves as guerrillas rather than brigands, but this is the fact. Ironically, the French armies believed that they were bringing enlightenment and modernity to the people of Europe. But what this often meant in a country under occupation was something completely different from discussing philosophes or French music or culture. What it meant in the case of Prussia, for instance, was quite horrific. After Prussia was defeated in 1806, the country endured 2 years of occupation, during which the French extracted 1.4 billion francs from it, which was more than 16 times the Prussian state's annual revenue. Okay, so those of you who think about the First World War and the indemnities put on Germany then, you can think about the indemnities put on Prussia in 1806, 16 times its annual revenue. The French troops lived off the land in Prussia, 350,000 of them, destroying villages, burning estates, confiscating horses, harvests, and stealing all sorts of livestock. Between August 1807 and December 1808, more than 100,000 horses were taken from Berlin alone. 100,000 horses in a year from Berlin, and 760,000 from the province of Brandenburg. East Prussia was stripped of 95% of its livestock. Berlin's infant mortality rose from 75% in 1807, rose to 75% in 1807-1808. So you can see the population here is on the brink of implosion. It's not sustaining itself. And opposition to this type of oppression is not hard to understand. So to keep orders, massacres were frequently committed. To keep order, massacres were frequently committed. Some of these massacres were when armed troops killed prisoners taken after the battle. And this, I said yesterday, is quite common. An army doesn't know what to do with suddenly tens of thousands of men who a few moments ago had been extremely hostile. Can you completely trust them? How do you keep order? The best way is to kill them. Sometimes these troops were taken after the end of a siege, and sometimes they included civilians. I'm going to talk about the Siege of Jaffa now, which took place in what is now Syria after Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1797-1798. And this is a sort of a glimpse of what might have happened if Napoleon had not been hemmed in by the Royal Navy and had been let loose on the world. He managed to get to Egypt, fought the Battle of the Pyramids, Napoleon, and then tried to march up into the Holy Land. I'm not quite sure. This map shows you Napoleon's global aspirations, which luckily didn't actually come true. But one of his aspirations was, of course, to annex the Holy Land and to march on India, to kick the British out of India, to become, even some people suggest he had a plan to attack Australia. Well, that would have been interesting. You can see that he was trying to get back control of the island of San Domingo, or Haiti, the most wealthy sugar island in the world, which had thrown off French rule. He had his eye on the French Canadians, the territory of Louisiana. This all came unstuck, this empire, this overseas empire, when France could not wrest naval superiority from Britain. And indeed, the writing was on the wall when he failed to reconquer San Domingo. Napoleon realized he didn't have the navy to contest for power in the New World, and he gave up. He sold Louisiana. gave up the Sugar Islands. But he did have this one moment in the sun, I suppose. Here, Napoleon was a master of his own image. All of these are propaganda, if you come to think of it, portraying Napoleon as this great general. But of course, he did have his moment in the sun when he went to Egypt, conquered the armies of the Ottoman Empire, including a corps of Mamelukes, which he incorporated into his own army, and then went marching up the coast of Palestine to a place called Jaffa, which briefly resisted him. And after a siege, the citizens surrendered. The French troops marched in, and under Napoleon's command, 3,000 citizens of Jaffa were massacred. He sent out an announcement after this was in 1798, he issued the following proclamation to whoever chose to listen. It is well that you should know that all human efforts against me are useless, for all I undertake must succeed. Those who declare themselves my allies prosper, those who oppose me perish. If I am terrible to my enemies, I am good to my friends, and above all, clement and merciful to the poor. In an attempt to, I suppose, retrospectively prove that he was clement and merciful to the poor, he had this picture of himself painted visiting the leper colony in Jaffa. I mean, believe it or not, he's just killed 3,000 of the citizens of Jaffa, but he chooses to commemorate this event by showing that he visits the poor and needy of the city. So, in other words, this is complete hypocrisy. And one of the soldiers who was involved in this massacre, when he came to write his memoirs years later, he said that he could hardly pick up the pen to write this passage of history. His hand was shaking so much with the recollection of the horrors of this massacre. So it was real, it happened, it was horrible. And Napoleon denied this particular one. In Eversberg, 3,000 Austrian wounded soldiers were burnt alive in 1809. Hundreds of Russian prisoners were massacred during the retreat from Moscow, when his troops basically shot any Russians that they had. Well, you can understand, you can't very well take along thousands of Russians on the retreat from Moscow when your own troops are dying in droves. You can't possibly feed or succor enemy troops, so just rather kill them. These troops are killed in batches, for example, of 300 at Vyazma, 600 at Smolensk, 1,200 were shot by Spanish and Portuguese auxiliaries working for Napoleon en route. To get to the peninsula in Spain, the Peninsular War, which is one of the most fought over parts of Napoleon's colonial empire. In the peninsula, when French troops took the city of Tarragona in Spain in June 1811, 15,000 civilians were massacred. It has to be said that when the British in the Peninsular Wars took the Spanish cities of Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz in 1811 and San Sebastian in 1812, they also massacred the civilian population. It was a thing that troops did after a particularly difficult siege. If the city had resisted and you had taken a lot of casualties, basically the generals then said, right, you troops can get your revenge once the city falls. I'm not suggesting that this is acceptable behavior, I'm saying that this happened. In Austrian Galicia in 1807, one French officer witnessed whole villages in which the inhabitants were dead in their houses, had not seen any living soul. The air was foul with the corruption of corpses. Sometimes the victims took their revenge on the French, as in a report by a French officer in Spain, 14th of June 1808. Look at this date, May 1808 in Madrid. This is a month later. there's a general uprising in Spain against the French troops. Quote, "I saw officers, soldiers and women disemboweled from the uterus to the stomach and breasts cut off, men sawed in half, other noble parts cut off and placed in the mouth, others buried live up to the shoulders, others hung by their feet in fireplaces and their heads burned. Finally, in Valdepenas, I saw 53 men buried up to their shoulders, surrounding a house serving as a hospital, where 400 men had been slaughtered, cut into pieces, and thrown into the streets and courtyards. This is the revenge of Spanish civilians on French soldiers." So massacre evokes massacre. There are victims and perpetrators. This picture by Goya shows an uprising of the Spanish citizens in Madrid against a French contingent. Interestingly, this contingent includes Mameluke troops. Quite whether the Spanish were provoked by the presence of black French soldiers into this act of rebellion, we don't know. But what we do know is that the next day the French troops regained control and of course began to massacre the citizens of Madrid. Goya, who was probably an eyewitness of these, went on to document this terrible war in a series of paintings and sketches and etchings, which are famous and perhaps one of the most, graphic, moving, profound descriptions of massacre that we have. All right, so these massacres are very often caused by resistance to French trying to dominate colonized territories. Philip Dwyer suggests there are two main sort of phases in this. There's the first phase is when the French troops move into an area and they basically shoot and destroy anybody who resists. Then there's the second phase where you're trying to keep law and order. And sometimes when there's too much resistance, you resort to what Philip Dwyer calls the politics of elimination. An example of this is in Belgium, which was annexed in 1795, and again in Belgium in 1798, when the Belgians erupted in a so-called peasants' war against the French, triggered by the imposition of conscription. And so in 1798, the French massacred 1,000 Belgians in a town called Hasselt, and massacred more in the uprising that followed. You can, and to a quick cook's tour of Europe in Switzerland, when priest-led Catholic peasants rose up in revolt against the annexation of Switzerland and its rebranding as the Helvetic Republic, they were massacred. Italy was plagued by resistance to French rule, usually inspired by the Italians' attachment to the Catholic Church, and they suffered massacre. You've already heard of the example of Bienesco. Napoleon wrote to General Junot in 1806 with advice: "It is not with words that one maintains peace in Italy. Do as I did in Binasco. A large village should be burnt. Have a dozen rebels shot." In July 1806, he dictated a letter to his brother Joseph, King of Naples, advising him to execute at least 600 rebels and to pillage 5 or 6 of the villages that had behaved the worst. Joseph carried out these orders, hanging and shooting 600 brigands over an 8-day period. Napoleon elaborated on his views to Joseph, explaining that he should actually welcome a revolt. Quote, "As long as you have not made an example, you will not be a master of the situation. Every conquered people needs a revolt. I would look upon a revolt in Naples as a father of a family looks upon smallpox visiting his children. As long as it does not weaken the patient too much, it is a salutary crisis." And so it goes on. And in another letter to Joseph, "In a conquered country, kindness is not humaneness. So what you can see from this is that massacre and oppression is a deliberate policy, a policy that is not just a response, a one-off response, a panicked response. It is a measured, calculated response. And very often these massacres are implemented by specially designated flying columns. You've heard of the infernal columns that operate in the Vendée. Special political commissioners were appointed at the head of fast-moving troops whose job it was to seek out dissent and opposition and to create some conditions of summary justice. People were arrested, tried and executed within 24 hours, and massacre was very often this tool of policy. In conclusion, what makes these massacres different to previous massacres of the Ancien Regime, was that they are done in the name of a secular modernizing state. That they were done by a people or a government thinking that it was bringing liberation, rationality and modernity to the people. And the people who resisted it, because they were reactionary, because they were backward, merited destruction. This was particularly the case if the opposition was led by priests. In the town of Loria, destroyed by fire in August 1806 by General Massacre, with nearly 1,000 casualties. The justification for these massacres was that the people had been inspired to resistance by priests and monks who had worked them up into a religious frenzy. This might well have been the case. I mean, priests and monks often did lead the peasants. They were trying to protect the churches. They very often did brandish Bibles and crosses. But to the French, this was pure superstition and ignorance, and it gave them the authorization to destroy people. There are hints that towards the end of Napoleon's rule, which, as you know, he abdicates in 1814, comes back after 100 days in 1815. Towards the end of his rule, he tries to cover up and hide certain massacres. He has control of the press, he has control of various publications. If the press reports on a massacre and the figures seem to Napoleon to be too inflated or uncomplimentary to the French forces, he makes sure that they modify what they say. So there's a hint that there's a degree of shame, but certainly not when it comes to on the ground where he has to implement these policies. He doesn't want the French people, in other words, to get a bad impression of the French army, but he's quite happy for the French army to indulge in these massacres. Not only were people killed because they were Catholic, as I've suggested, that Jacques Semelin says it's necessary to other people before you kill them. The French very often referred to their enemies, the Southern Europeans, as being dirty,